I never thought I'd be standing in my daughter's pristine living room, holding out the faded deed to the very house we were standing in, watching her face transform from righteous confidence to shocked disbelief. The house that my mother had, purchased 60 years ago with her nursing salary. The house where 3 generations of our family had celebrated holidays, weathered storms, and built memories. "But Grandma can't live here anymore," Sarah had insisted just moments earlier. "She needs professional care, and this house isn't suitable for someone her age." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Sarah didn't know was that the house had never truly been hers to begin with. The confrontation had been brewing for months. At 83, my mother Helen was still remarkably independent, her mind sharp despite her body's gradual betrayal. The hip replacement last fall had slowed her down, and the stairs in the Victorian home were becoming a daily challenge. But the garden that wrapped around the house was her sanctuary. Every rosebush, clematis vine, and perennial bed planted and tended by her hands across decades. When I arrived that morning for our weekly coffee, Sarah had greeted me with that familiar, determined expression. The one she'd worn since childhood when she'd made up her mind about something. Her husband Richard hovered in the background, nodding supportively while their teenage children made themselves scarce, sensing the coming storm. "Mom, we need to talk about Grandma," Sarah began, gesturing for me to sit at their expansive kitchen island. "Richard and I have been researching assisted living facilities. We found a beautiful place just 20 minutes from here, Evergreen Meadows. They have an opening next month." "Your grandmother has been clear about wanting to stay in her home," I reminded her, though we'd been through this conversation repeatedly. "She's managing with the part-time help from Nurse Marianne." Sarah exchanged a glance with Richard before continuing. "The house is becoming dangerous for her, Mom. The stairs, the old plumbing, the distance from emergency services, and frankly, the neighborhood isn't what it used to be." What she didn't say, but what I knew she was thinking, was that the charming Victorian on 2 acres of prime land in the rapidly gentrifying Oakwood neighborhood was becoming increasingly valuable. Developers had been leaving offers in mailboxes, up and down the street, hoping to replace the historic homes with luxury condominiums. "Besides," Sarah continued, gaining momentum, "this house needs to work for our family too. Aiden will be driving soon, and we need the extra parking space that's taken up by Grandma's garden. Emma's friends are always over, and having to be quiet because Grandma is napping is becoming an issue. And the maintenance," Richard added, speaking up for the first time. "That old boiler system alone is going to need replacing soon. The property is becoming a money pit." I took a slow sip of my coffee, studying my daughter's face. When had she become this person? This woman who viewed her grandmother's beloved home primarily as a real estate opportunity and inconvenience? Sarah had moved into the house with her family 5 years ago when Richard lost his executive position during corporate downsizing. The plan had been temporary, just until they got back on their feet. My mother had welcomed them with open arms, moving from the primary bedroom to the smaller downstairs guest room to give them more space. Now Richard was back on his feet with a new job, but they had grown comfortable in the spacious Victorian. Too comfortable. "We're doing this out of concern for Grandma," Sarah insisted, misreading my silence. "It's not safe for her to live alone anymore, and we can't provide the level of care she needs." "She's not alone," I corrected quietly. "She lives with you. You know what I mean, Mom. During the day when we're all out, if she fell again. That's why she has Nurse Marianne coming in daily." Sarah's expression hardened. "We've made up our minds. We've already put down a deposit at Evergreen Meadows. The room will be ready on the 15th next month." "You've done this without even discussing it with me? Or with your grandmother?" The heat was rising in my voice now. "Because you both refuse to be reasonable." Sarah's composure slipped, revealing her frustration. "Grandma is stubborn and you enable her. Sometimes you have to make the hard decisions for elderly parents when they can't make them for themselves. That's when I saw it. Not just entitlement, but genuine belief that she was doing the right thing. In Sarah's mind, the house was effectively theirs, and my mother was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. A guest in the home she had purchased in 1963, where she had raised me alone after my father's early death, where she had built a life and a legacy. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. Sarah, whose name do you think is on the deed to this house? She blinked, thrown by the apparent non sequitur. Well, technically Grandma's, I suppose. But we've been living here for 5 years, paying the property taxes and maintenance. And you always said this house would stay in the family. Did you ever ask to see the deed? A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Why would I need to? We had an understanding when we moved in. I reached into my handbag and withdrew the folded document I had retrieved from my mother's safety deposit box the previous week, after she confided her fears of being shipped off to die in some facility. The paper was worn at the creases, the legal language faded but still legible. Your grandmother put this house in a specific type of trust 20 years ago, I explained, unfolding the document on the kitchen island. She wanted to ensure it would always remain a family home, but with conditions. The house can never be sold while she's alive, and she maintains a legal right to reside here regardless of who lives with her. Furthermore, I paused, turning to the second page. If any attempt is made to remove her against her will, full control of the property reverts to me as the trustee. Sarah stared at the document, her face draining of color. Richard moved closer, peering over her shoulder at the legal language neither of them had known existed. But we've invested thousands in improvements, Richard began, his voice strained. The new roof, the updated kitchen. Improvements to a home you've been living in rent-free, I reminded him gently. A home that has sheltered your family when you needed it most. Sarah's eyes met mine, shock giving way to something else. Perhaps the dawning realization that she had miscalculated badly. The power dynamic she had assumed was suddenly inverted. The ground beneath her carefully laid plans had shifted. Mom, we were just trying to do what's best for everyone, she whispered. But the conviction had vanished from her voice. I know. You believe that, Sarah? But now it's time to have an honest conversation about what best for everyone really means. The Victorian house on Maple Avenue hadn't always been at the center of family tension. For decades, it had been the heart of our family, a place where love outweighed its creaking floorboards and outdated fixtures. My mother, Helen Sullivan, had purchased the house in 1963 as a young widow with a 4-year-old daughter, me. My father, James, had died unexpectedly of a heart attack, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy that provided just enough for a down payment on the dilapidated Victorian that no one else wanted. The neighborhood had been working class then, filled with factory workers and teachers, nurses and mechanics, all striving for their piece of the American dream. This house has good bones, Mom had told me years later, explaining why she'd chosen a fixer-upper that required so much work. Just like people, Margaret, what matters most is underneath all the surface problems. And she'd been right. The house had endured, just as she had. A pediatric nurse with a seemingly endless reservoir of compassion, Mom had worked night shifts for years so she could be home when I returned from school. She'd pack her uniform into her practical beige handbag, kiss me goodnight, and leave me in the care of our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, who would sleep on our couch and be there if I needed anything before morning. During daylight hours, Mom transformed the neglected Victorian bit by bit. She learned to repair plaster from a library book, sanded floors on her days off, and planted a garden that eventually became the envy of the neighborhood. Her hands, always gentle with her tiny patients at the hospital, became calloused and strong from home repairs she couldn't afford to hire out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A woman needs to know how to use a hammer, she'd tell me, placing the tool in my small hands and guiding my awkward attempts at hanging picture frames, and a saw, and a wrench, and how to wire a lamp. No one should be helpless in their own home. Those lessons had served me well after I married Thomas, an accountant whose financial acumen was matched only by his complete lack of practical skills. Our first apartment had benefited greatly from the household repair knowledge Mom had insisted I learn. Later, when we bought our modest ranch house across town, it was Mom who helped me remodel the outdated kitchen on a shoestring budget. Sarah, our only child, had grown up between these two houses, her own home and her grandmother's Victorian. While Thomas and I both worked full-time, Sarah often spent afternoons and school breaks with Mom, helping in the garden and absorbing stories about our family history. "This rosebush," Mom would tell her, pointing to a particularly robust climber by the back porch, "was propagated from a cutting your great-grandmother brought from Ireland. It survived nearly a century of winters because its roots run deep." Sarah had seemed to treasure these stories once, carefully recording some in a journal she kept throughout middle school. She'd drawn detailed maps of the garden, labeling each plant with its history and meaning. The maple tree where we hung a swing, for her 10th birthday. The dogwood planted when my father died, now majestic and blooming faithfully each spring. The herb garden where Mom taught her to tell the difference between beneficial insects and pests. When had that changed? Perhaps it had been gradual, like the neighborhood's transformation from working class to upscale. Property values began rising. When Sarah was in high school, as young professionals discovered the charm of the historic district and its proximity to downtown, the auto parts store on the corner became a boutique coffee shop. The corner grocery transformed into an artisanal bakery. Through it all, Mom remained steadfast, politely declining increasingly generous offers from developers eager to replace the Victorian with luxury townhomes. "This house isn't just lumber and nails," she would say. "It's where Margaret took her first steps. It's where I grieved James and found my strength. Some things shouldn't have a price tag." Sarah had gone to college on a combination of scholarships, our savings and Mom's contribution, money she'd set aside from her nursing pension specifically for her granddaughter's education. After graduation, Sarah had met Richard, an ambitious business consultant with impeccable credentials and a 5-year plan that impressed everyone, especially himself. Their wedding had been held in Mom's backyard, the garden in full bloom providing a natural cathedral. Mom had spent months preparing, nurturing each plant to perfection for her beloved granddaughter's special day. In photos from that day, joy radiates from all our faces. Sarah in her elegant gown beneath the rose-covered arbor, Richard handsome and confident, Thomas with his arm around my waist, and Mom, her silver hair styled for the occasion, beaming, with the pride of a woman who had built a legacy of love. The first few years of Sarah and Richard's marriage had been a whirlwind of career advancement and achievement. They purchased a sleek condominium downtown, entertained Richard's colleagues, and traveled extensively. Children hadn't been part of their initial plan, but nature had its own agenda. Sarah's unexpected pregnancy with Aiden had been followed, surprisingly quickly by Emma's arrival 14 months later. The sudden shift from career-focused couple to parents of 2 under 2 had been jarring for them. Their expensive condominiums suddenly felt cramped. Daycare costs for 2 infants strained, even their substantial dual incomes. The carefree lifestyle they'd enjoyed transformed overnight into an exhausting marathon of diaper changes, sleepless nights, and childcare logistics. Then came the corporate merger that eliminated Richard's position, along with his 6-figure salary and executive benefits. The timing couldn't have been worse. They were already stretched financially with the second baby, and the job market had tightened considerably. When 2 months of searching yielded no comparable opportunities, panic began to set in. It was Mom who had offered them sanctuary. "Family takes care of family," she said simply, inviting them to move into the Victorian. "There's plenty of room for all of you, and I could use the company." The arrangement was meant to be temporary. 6 months, perhaps a year at most. Sarah and Richard would save on housing costs while he found new employment, and Mom would have help with home maintenance and the company of her great-grandchildren. I had concerns about potential friction, knowing my daughter's more particular nature might clash with Mom's independent spirit, but the immediate crisis overrode those worries. "It's the perfect solution," Thomas had assured me. "Your mother gets some support as she ages, and Sarah's family gets breathing room to regroup." 5 years later, what had begun as a temporary safety net had evolved into an unspoken, permanent arrangement. Richard eventually found a new position, but at a considerably lower salary than before. The children settled into schools and activities in the neighborhood, and somehow, gradually, the dynamic within the house shifted from guests being grateful for shelter to hosts becoming increasingly territorial. Looking at Sarah's shocked face as she stared at the deed, I wondered if she even remembered that the beautiful home she now considered rightfully hers had once been her sanctuary in crisis. The transition had happened so subtly that none of us recognized it at the time. What began as gratitude, Sarah bringing Mom fresh flowers each week, Richard insisting on handling the yard work, the children drawing pictures to brighten Mom's refrigerator, gradually transformed into something else entirely. The first hint of change came about 8 months after they moved in. I'd stopped by on a Sunday afternoon to help Mom sort through some old photographs. When I arrived, I found the living room, once decorated with Mom's carefully collected antiques and family heirlooms, had been completely rearranged. The vintage sofa where Dad had proposed to Mom was gone, replaced by a sleek sectional in a shade Sarah called greige. Mom's hand-knotted Persian rug, a splurge she'd saved 3 years for, had been rolled up and stored in the attic. Sarah thought it would be safer if I had more modern furniture, Mom explained, noticing my surprise. Less cluttered, fewer things to trip over. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but I caught the slight downturn at the corners of her mouth. Still, she smiled brightly when Sarah entered carrying a tray of tea. "Doesn't the room look spacious now? And so much more light without those heavy drapes." I said nothing, reminding myself that accommodation on both sides was necessary for multi-generational living to work. Mom was being flexible, adapting to having young children in the home again. This was a good thing, wasn't it? A month later, Mom called to tell me she'd decided to move her bedroom from the master suite on the 2nd floor to the smaller guest room off the kitchen. "The stairs are getting harder on my knees," she said, a reasonable explanation that didn't quite explain the timing. "And Sarah and Richard need more space with the children. The master bedroom has that little sitting area that would make a perfect homework spot for Aiden." Again, it seemed a sensible adjustment, even generous. Mom was in her late 70s then, still spry but beginning to show her age. Ground floor living made practical sense. What I didn't know until much later was that Sarah had orchestrated the bedroom switch, commenting repeatedly about the wasted space upstairs and how inconvenient it was for Aiden to do homework at the kitchen table while Emma watched television in the adjacent family room. The garden was the next casualty. Mom had always maintained the extensive gardens herself, spending hours each day tending her beloved plants. 6 months into the new living arrangement, I arrived to find a landscaping crew removing the heirloom rose bushes along the east side of the property. "We're putting in a play structure for the kids," Richard explained, clipboard in hand as he supervised the workers. "Kids need outdoor space to run around, and those thorny roses were a safety hazard." Mom stood at the kitchen window, watching silently as decades-old plants were unceremoniously dug up and discarded. When I moved to stand beside her, she patted my hand reassuringly. "Children need room to play," she said softly. "Roses can be replanted. But the new roses would never be the same. They wouldn't carry the history, the memories, the decades of careful cultivation." We both knew this, yet neither of us said it aloud. Later that summer, Mom's Bridge Club, which had met in her dining room every Thursday afternoon for over 30 years, was relocated to the community center downtown. Sarah needs the dining room for Emma's homeschool activities, Mom explained when I questioned the change. And honestly, it's probably better. Some of the ladies have mobility issues, and the community center has better accessibility. One sacrifice after another, each seemingly minor on its own. Each framed as a practical necessity, or even as Mom's own choice. But collectively, they formed a pattern I should have recognized sooner. The gradual erasure of Mom's presence within her own home. The quiet diminishment of her authority and autonomy. The most significant change came 2 years into the arrangement. Mom had planned a special dinner to celebrate her 80th birthday, inviting her closest friends and our small extended family. She'd spent days preparing her signature dishes, including the caramel apple cake that had marked every special occasion throughout my childhood. I arrived early to help with final preparations, only to find Mom sitting alone in her bedroom while caterers bustled throughout the first floor, setting up an elaborate spread that bore no resemblance to what she had planned. There was a change of plans, Mom said simply, her hands folded in her lap. Sarah thought a proper celebration required professional catering. She's invited several of Richard's business associates as well. Apparently he's up for a promotion, and this is a good opportunity to make an impression. My mother's 80th birthday celebration had been co-opted into a networking event for my son-in-law's career advancement. The guests who arrived were predominantly strangers to Mom, who spent most of her own party sitting quietly in a corner, accepting occasional congratulations from people who knew nothing about her life or accomplishments. When I confronted Sarah afterward, she seemed genuinely perplexed by my concern. Grandma was overwhelmed by all the cooking, she insisted. I did her a favor by hiring professionals, and the party was so much more elegant this way. When I pointed out that none of Mom's favorite foods had been served, Sarah dismissed this with a wave. Those old recipes are so heavy and outdated. The caterer's menu was much healthier and more sophisticated. That night, alone with Thomas in our own home, I voiced my growing unease about the situation. She's being gradually pushed out of her own life, Thomas. It's like she's becoming a guest in her own home. Helen chose to invite them in, he reminded me gently, and she seems to be accepting these changes willingly. Maybe she's simply adapting to a new chapter in her life. She's always been practical above all else. But at what cost? Everything that makes the house hers is disappearing. Her furniture, her garden, her routines, her authority, it's all being systematically dismantled. Thomas patted my hand, his accountant's mind framing the situation in practical terms. They're providing her with companionship, maintenance, and security as she ages. That's worth some compromise, isn't it? And remember how desperate they were when Richard lost his job. Your mother saved them from financial disaster. He was right, of course. Mom had extended herself fully to provide a haven for her granddaughter's family in crisis. She had welcomed them with open arms, rearranged her life to accommodate theirs, and asked for nothing in return except the continuation of family bonds. What none of us realized then was that her generosity would eventually be reframed as dependency, her accommodations taken as entitlement, and her home, the physical embodiment of her life's work, gradually appropriated by those she'd sought to help. The greatest irony was that Mom had always been the most independent person I knew. She had raised me alone, maintained a demanding career, and transformed a dilapidated house into a showplace through her own labor. The narrative Sarah was now constructing, of a frail elderly woman who needed decisions made for her, was a fundamental misrepresentation of who Helen Sullivan had always been. But perception is powerful, especially when it serves the perceiver's interests. And by the time I fully recognized what was happening, the pattern had become deeply entrenched. Mom had already surrendered so much, one small concession at a time, that pushing back against the established dynamic seemed increasingly difficult. "It's fine, Margaret," she would say whenever I raised concerns. "Every generation has to make room for the next. That's the natural order of things." But there was nothing natural about the specific order emerging in the Victorian on Maple Avenue. an order in which the woman who had built everything was being systematically relegated to its margins. The first serious red flag appeared last fall, around the time of Mom's hip replacement surgery. She had been managing remarkably well, despite the gradual erosion of her authority in the house. Her health had remained stable, her mind sharp as ever. The hip issue wasn't unexpected. Osteoarthritis runs in our family, and at 83, Mom had fared better than many. The surgery went smoothly, and her doctor was optimistic about a full recovery with proper rehabilitation. The plan was straightforward. A week in the hospital, 2 weeks in a skilled nursing facility for intensive physical therapy, then home with outpatient therapy 3 times weekly until she regained her mobility. I visited Mom daily during her hospital stay, often bringing the grandchildren after school. Sarah came when her schedule allowed, usually rushing in between work commitments, her attention divided between her phone and her grandmother. The house feels so much calmer without all the medical equipment, Sarah commented during one visit, scrolling through emails while Mom dozed. When I asked what she meant, she elaborated. You know, Grandma's pill organizers cluttering the kitchen counter, her walking sticks by every door, those compression stockings hanging in the bathroom. Richard's even thinking of turning her bedroom into a proper home office while she's away. She'll only be gone for 3 weeks total, I reminded her, keeping my voice low. Sarah shrugged. I'm just saying it's nice to have the space feel like a normal family home for once, without being reminded of mortality every time you turn around. The comment struck me as callous, but I attributed it to the stress everyone was under. Sarah had taken on additional responsibilities at her marketing firm, and Richard's new position came with intense pressure to perform. Managing 2 active teenagers while maintaining a demanding professional life wasn't easy. Still, something about her phrasing, a normal family home, lingered uncomfortably, as if Mom's presence was an abnormality rather than the very foundation of that home's existence. When Mom transferred to Silver Pines Rehabilitation Center, another concerning pattern emerged. The grandchildren's visits became increasingly rare, with Sarah citing homework, extracurricular activities, and the depressing environment of the facility as reasons they couldn't come. Kids shouldn't be exposed to all that suffering, she explained when I questioned why Aiden and Emma hadn't accompanied her. Besides, they're busy with their own lives. Emma has dance competitions coming up, and Aiden is focused on college applications. Mom never complained, but I noticed how her face would light up when the children did visit, and how she would talk about those brief encounters for days afterward. She kept a photo of them on her bedside table and proudly introduced them to her physical therapists as my brilliant great-grandchildren who live with me. Who live with me, not who I live with. The distinction was subtle but significant. In Mom's mind, the Victorian was still unquestionably her home, where she had generously made room for Sarah's family. But I was beginning to suspect Sarah's perspective had shifted dramatically from that understanding. The rehabilitation progressed well, and Mom worked diligently with her therapists, determined to regain her independence. By the end of the 2nd week, she was walking short distances with a walker and performing her exercises with characteristic determination. Dr. Patel says I'm ahead of schedule, she told me proudly during one of my visits. I should be able to manage the 3 steps to the back porch when I get home, especially with the railing Richard installed last year. But when I mentioned this progress to Sarah, her response was unexpectedly guarded. The physical therapist called me yesterday, she said, her voice dropping into the concerned tone I was beginning to recognize as a prelude to boundary adjustments. She thinks Grandma should consider a ground-floor living situation with no steps at all. Apparently, hip replacements in patients over 80 have a high risk of complications. Mom's bedroom is already on the ground floor, I pointed out. Yes, but the shower is up 3 steps, and there's the back porch and the sunken living room. The therapist suggested we look into assisted living facilities that are designed for seniors with mobility issues. I was immediately suspicious. Which therapist said this? Mom's primary physical therapist is Dr. Kim, and she's been extremely positive about Mom's progress. Sarah's gaze slid away from mine. One of the others, I don't remember her name, but she was very concerned. Later that week, I spoke directly with Dr. Kim, who confirmed my suspicions. "Your mother is doing exceptionally well," she assured me. "She's one of our strongest patients in her age group. With proper support at home, grab bars in the bathroom, a raised toilet seat, her walker for longer distances, she should be able to navigate her environment safely." When I asked if she or anyone on her team had suggested assisted living too, my daughter, Dr. Kim, looked confused. "Not at all. Our goal has always been to get Helen back to her prior living situation. She's nowhere near requiring that level of care." The fabricated medical advice was disturbing enough, but what followed was even more alarming. 3 days before Mom was scheduled to return home, I arrived at the Victorian to help prepare her room, only to find it in the midst of a transformation. The bed had been replaced by a sleek desk with dual monitors. Filing cabinets stood where her dresser had been. The walls, once adorned with family photographs and artwork collected over decades, were now bare except for Richard's framed business certificates. "What is going on here?" I demanded, finding Sarah in the kitchen reviewing fabric swatches. "Oh, we've decided to convert Mom's old office upstairs into a bedroom for Grandma," she explained casually. "It's actually a better space for her. More sunlight. And it's closer to the main bathroom that already has those safety rails installed. Upstairs? Mom can't manage a full flight of stairs with a new hip replacement," Sarah waved dismissively. "Richard found this amazing chairlift online. It's being installed tomorrow. Top of the line, very sleek design. It'll actually add value to the house when we eventually sell." The presumption was breathtaking. Not only had they unilaterally decided to move Mom to a different room without consulting either of us, but they were apparently already considering selling the house. A house that wasn't theirs to sell. "Mom is coming home in 3 days," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "Her doctor has approved her returning to her ground floor bedroom, which is now, apparently, Richard's office." "It's a temporary arrangement," Sarah insisted. "Just until Grandma is stronger and can handle the stairs with the lift. Richard needs a proper workspace now that he's handling larger accounts. His company expects executives to project a certain image during video calls, and working from the dining room table isn't professional." The justifications continued, each one revealing how completely the narrative had shifted. What had once been, "We're so grateful Grandma is letting us stay in her home," had become, "We need to reorganize Grandma's living arrangements to accommodate our professional needs." I left that day without resolving the issue, my mind racing with concern. That evening, I called Thomas from the car, more upset than I'd been in years. "They're moving her upstairs, Thomas, after hip replacement surgery, against medical advice, so Richard can have a fancier backdrop for his Zoom calls." Thomas, usually the voice of measured reason, was equally disturbed. "That's not just inconsiderate, Margaret. It could be dangerous for Helen." "What am I supposed to do? They've already converted her room. The chairlift is being installed tomorrow." There was a long pause before Thomas replied, his voice unusually serious. "I think it's time to speak with Helen's attorney. This has gone beyond family disagreement into something potentially harmful." The next morning, I called Eleanor Griggs, Mom's friend and attorney who had handled her affairs for decades. Eleanor listened carefully to my concerns, her silence growing heavier as I detailed the recent developments. "Helen gave me specific instructions years ago," she said finally. "I had hoped they wouldn't become necessary, but it seems they have. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There's something you need to see." Eleanor's office was in one of the few remaining historic buildings downtown, a dignified brick structure that had housed her small practice for over 30 years. The interior was comfortably old-fashioned, leather chairs worn smooth with use, walls lined with actual law books rather than decorative props, and the faint scent of lemon polish and coffee that always reminded me of my father's study. Your mother is a remarkable woman, Eleanor began, once I was seated across from her. Smart, practical, and, most people don't realize this, extraordinarily strategic. She pulled a file from her cabinet, its tab marked simply, Sullivan Residence. The documents inside were organized with Mom's characteristic precision. Property, deeds, tax records, insurance policies, all meticulously maintained. Helen came to see me about 8 years ago, Eleanor continued. Right around the time your father-in-law had that health scare, remember? It got her thinking about her own future and what might happen to her home as she aged. Mom had never mentioned this meeting to me, but then she had always handled her affairs independently, viewing excessive discussion of financial matters as somehow impolite. She was concerned about several scenarios, Eleanor explained. About potentially needing long-term care herself someday, about predatory developers pressuring elderly residents to sell in that neighborhood, and most specifically, about ensuring her home remained a haven for family without becoming a source of conflict. Eleanor handed me a document titled Amendment to Property Trust. This is what she ultimately decided to do. She placed the house in a specialized trust that would accomplish several things simultaneously. First, it protected the house from being counted as an asset if she ever needed Medicaid for long-term care. Second, it prevented the house from being sold during her lifetime without her explicit consent. And third, this is the part that's relevant now, it established what's called a life estate that guarantees her right to live in that home until her death, regardless of any other arrangements regarding the property. I stared at the document, the legal terminology swimming before my eyes. So, even though she's allowed Sarah's family to live there, she retains an absolute legal right to continue living there herself in the manner of her choosing. Eleanor. Confirmed. No one can remove her from that house or substantially alter her living arrangements without her consent, not even family members residing there with her permission. The implications were enormous. All this time, as Sarah and Richard had gradually assumed ownership in practice, if not in name, the legal reality had remained unchanged. The Victorian had never ceased to be Mom's home in the most fundamental sense. There's more, Eleanor said, turning to another section of the document. Helen designated you as the trustee in the event she becomes unable to advocate for herself. This means you have legal authority to enforce the terms of the trust, on her behalf if necessary. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Mom had protected herself legally, sadness that such protection had become necessary, and a strange guilt that I hadn't been more proactive in preventing the situation from deteriorating to this point. Did Mom anticipate this specific scenario? Sarah and Richard trying to relocate her against medical advice? Eleanor's expression softened. Not exactly. She was thinking more about the possibility of gradually losing her voice in household decisions as she aged. The hip replacement and stair issue couldn't have been foreseen. But she did worry about the essential power dynamic, about family members who were guests in her home eventually coming to view themselves as the rightful decision-makers. That's exactly what's happened, I said quietly. They've rewritten the narrative completely. In their minds, they're the homeowners graciously accommodating an elderly relative, not adult children living in their mother's home. It's unfortunately common, Eleanor nodded. I've seen it repeatedly throughout my career. The slide from gratitude to entitlement can be remarkably swift, especially when valuable property is involved. She handed me an official copy of the trust document, along with a letter Mom had written to be shared, if circumstances require. Helen hoped these would never be needed, Eleanor said. She believed family bonds and mutual respect would prevail over self-interest. But she was also realistic. She understood that housing arrangements and financial matters can strain even the strongest relationships. As I left Eleanor's office, trust documents secured in my bag, I felt a strange mix of empowerment and sorrow. Mom had provided me with the legal means to protect her interests, but the fact that such protection had become necessary represented a profound failure of family trust. The elegant Victorian on Maple Avenue had become more than just a family home. It was now the physical battlefield for a struggle that went far beyond property rights. It had become a contest of narratives, of perceived entitlement versus actual ownership, of convenience versus care. And somewhere in the middle of this conflict was my mother, increasingly vulnerable physically, but, as Eleanor had just revealed, far more legally protected than anyone had realized. The days before Mom's scheduled return from rehabilitation were tense. Despite my objections, Richard installed the stair lift, a sleek, modern contraption that looked jarringly out of place against the Victorian's ornate banister. Sarah busied herself setting up the converted upstairs bedroom, filling it with new furniture that, while objectively nice, bore no resemblance to Mom's preferred style. "We've ordered a special ergonomic mattress," she informed me during one of my visits, "and a smart TV that she can control by voice. It's actually going to be much better than her old room." I chose my words carefully. "Have you discussed any of these changes with your grandmother?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "We want it to be a surprise, a welcome home gift." "Surprises aren't always welcome when you're recovering from major surgery," I pointed out, "especially when they involve completely different living arrangements than what you're expecting." "Mom, you're overreacting. Grandma will adapt. She always does." That was precisely the problem. Mom had always adapted, always accommodated, always put others' needs before her own. Her flexibility had been reinterpreted as malleability, her generosity as surrender. The morning of Mom's discharge from Silver Pines, I arrived early to drive her home. She was dressed and ready, her few personal items packed neatly in the small suitcase I'd brought her 3 weeks earlier. "I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to sleeping in my own bed tonight," she said as we drove, gazing out at the familiar streets of the neighborhood she'd called home for 6 decades. Hospital mattresses are designed for anything but comfort. I felt a knot form in my stomach, knowing what awaited her. "Mom, I need to prepare you for some changes Sarah and Richard have made." Her expression remained calm as I explained about the converted office, the stair lift, the new upstairs bedroom. Only a slight tightening around her eyes betrayed her feelings. "I see," she said simply when I finished. "Well, that's certainly a surprise." "You don't have to accept this arrangement," I said, gripping the steering wheel more tightly than necessary. "It's your house, Mom. You have every right to—" "Let's just see what they've done," she interrupted gently. "Perhaps it won't be as bad as you're anticipating." But it was every bit as bad as I'd feared. When we arrived, Sarah greeted us with exaggerated enthusiasm, immediately launching into a detailed tour of the upgrades they'd made for Mom's comfort and safety. "You'll love the new arrangement, Grandma," she gushed, guiding Mom toward the stair lift. "Richard, show Grandma how the chair works." Richard emerged from what had been Mom's ground floor bedroom, now completely transformed into a sleek home office. The desk dominated the space, multiple monitors gleaming with spreadsheets and graphs. "Helen, welcome home. Let me demonstrate this amazing lift we've installed. Top of the line, whisper quiet operation. You'll barely notice you're moving." Mom stood quietly, leaning on her walker, as Richard detailed the stair lift's features with the enthusiasm of a salesman closing a deal. Through it all, her expression remained politely neutral, though I noticed how tightly her hands gripped the walker's handles. "And we've completely redone the upstairs bedroom," Sarah continued, oblivious to Mom's silence. "New ergonomic furniture, blackout curtains for better sleep, a smart TV you can control with voice commands, everything designed for maximum comfort." "That sounds very modern," Mom said, her voice carefully measured. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. My physical therapist has specifically instructed me to avoid stairs entirely for the first 6 weeks of recovery. Even with a lift, Getting up and down would put unnecessary strain on my hip. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Oh, but this lift eliminates any strain. You just sit and press a button. It's actually recommended for hip replacement patients. By whom? I asked sharply. Which medical professional recommended a stair lift? For an 83-year-old woman immediately following hip replacement surgery? The momentary flash of annoyance across Sarah's face confirmed what I already suspected. No medical professional had recommended this arrangement. It had been designed entirely around Richard's desire for a home office, not Mom's recovery needs. I'm sure we can work this out, Richard interjected smoothly. Perhaps Helen could try the lift and see how comfortable it is before making a decision. Mom's voice, when she spoke, was quieter than usual, but remarkably firm. I won't be using the stair lift, Richard. My bedroom has always been here on the ground floor, and that's where I'll be staying during my recovery. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Sarah recovered first, her expression hardening into something less welcoming. Grandma, we've invested considerable time and money into creating a better space for you upstairs. Richard needs a professional environment for his work calls. His promotion depends on projecting the right image. I understand that, Mom replied. But this is still my home, and I need a bedroom I can safely access during my recovery. Your home? Sarah's tone had an edge I'd never heard her use with Mom before. We've been maintaining this house for 5 years now. We've paid the property taxes, funded major repairs, modernized outdated systems. At what point does our investment count? Richard placed a warning hand on Sarah's arm, but she shrugged it off. Years of unspoken resentment finally finding voice. We've put our lives on hold living in this outdated house because you refused to downsize to something more appropriate for a woman your age. We've worked around your gardening obsession, your bridge club, your antiques that aren't even valuable, just old. We've done everything to accommodate you, and the one time we ask for a reasonable adjustment to meet our professional needs, you refuse? Mom's face had gone very pale, but her voice remained steady. I invited your family into my home when you needed shelter. I never asked for payment. I never expected to be treated as a guest in the home I've owned for 60 years. Mom, I said quietly, why don't we get you settled in the living room while I speak with Sarah and Richard privately? But Sarah wasn't finished. This is exactly the problem. You're not capable of making rational decisions anymore. You're being stubborn and selfish, refusing to see that this arrangement would be better for everyone. Everyone? Mom asked softly. Or just you and Richard? The confrontation left all of us shaken. Sarah stormed upstairs with Emma following closely behind, confusion evident on the teenager's face. Richard retreated to his new office, closing the door with deliberate restraint that somehow communicated more anger than a slam would have. Aiden, caught in the crossfire of adult conflict, mumbled something about homework and disappeared into the kitchen. I helped Mom settle in the living room, acutely aware of how the space had changed during her 3-week absence. The comfortable armchair where she used to read her mystery novels had been replaced by a streamlined recliner that looked stylish, but offered little in the way of actual support. The side table where she kept her reading glasses and current book was gone, replaced by a decorative plant stand with a spindly fern. Would you like some tea? I asked, desperate to provide some. Normalcy. Mom nodded, her composure finally beginning to crack. As I moved toward the kitchen, I heard her whisper, I don't recognize my own home anymore, Margaret. The kitchen, at least, remained somewhat familiar, though even here changes were evident. Mom's collection of hand-painted teacups, gathered over decades of travel and gifts, had been replaced by a matched set of minimalist white mugs. The refrigerator, once a gallery of children's artwork and family photos, was now bare stainless steel. As I waited for the kettle to boil, Aiden wandered in, his tall frame hunched with adolescent discomfort. Is great-grandma okay? He asked, quietly. She's having a difficult homecoming, I replied honestly. A lot has changed while she was away. He nodded, seeming older than his 16 years. Mom and Dad have been working on the house every day since Great-Grandma went to the hospital. Dad says it's increasing the property value. The kettle whistled, and I busied myself preparing Mom's tea. Earl Grey, 2 sugars, splash of milk, a formula I'd known my entire life. Aiden, where are Great-Grandma's teacups? The ones with the flowers? He shrugged. Mom boxed up a bunch of stuff from the kitchen. Said it was cluttering the counters. I think the boxes are in the basement. When I returned to the living room, Mom was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall where her wedding portrait had once hung. In its place was an abstract canvas in shades of blue and gray that matched the room's new color scheme perfectly while conveying nothing of the home's history or heart. "Your tea," I said gently, placing the mug on the coffee table within her reach. She nodded her thanks but made no move to take it. "I should have seen this coming," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. All the little changes, one by one. I told myself I was being generous, making room for them during a difficult time. But I was really just disappearing. Piece by piece. "Mom, this is still your home. You have every right to—" "Do I?" she interrupted, a rare note of bitterness coloring her words. "Look around, Margaret. Do you see anything of me left in this room? Anything that suggests I ever existed here, let alone owned this house for 60 years? She was right. The living room had been completely transformed into a showplace that could have been featured in any contemporary home magazine. Stylish, impersonal, and devoid of the warm touches that had once made it uniquely hers. "They've erased me," she continued, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her exhaustion. "Not just my things, but my presence, my authority, my history in this home. And now they want to move me upstairs, out of sight, while they continue pretending this house has always been theirs." I had never heard my mother sound so defeated. This woman who had faced widowhood at 34 with a young child to raise, who had worked night shifts while renovating a dilapidated house, who had single-handedly created a beautiful home and gardened through sheer determination and hard work. This indomitable spirit was now sitting before me, diminished and uncertain. "We'll fix this," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure how. "This is your home, Mom. We won't let them push you out of it." She shook her head slightly. "I'm tired, Margaret. So tired of fighting for space, for consideration, for basic respect, in my own home. Maybe Sarah is right. Maybe at my age, I should be somewhere else, somewhere designed for people in my situation." "Is that really what you want?" I asked, alarmed by this sudden capitulation. "What I want," she said softly, "is to live the final chapter of my life with dignity, to be surrounded by memories that matter to me, to tend my garden and use my own teacups and sleep in my own bedroom. But I'm beginning to think that's not possible anymore. Not here." The defeat in her voice broke my heart. This wasn't just about a bedroom or furniture or even the house itself. It was about identity, agency, and the fundamental right to maintain control over one's own environment, especially in advanced age. "Don't make any decisions right now," I urged. "You're exhausted from the rehabilitation center, and this homecoming has been stressful. Let's take some time to think things through." She nodded absently, finally reaching for her tea. "I think I'd like to lie down. The drive tired me more than I expected." The implications hung silently between us. Where would she lie down? Her bedroom was now Richard's office. The room they'd prepared upstairs was inaccessible without using the stair lift she'd already refused. "You can rest in my old room," offered Aiden, who had been quietly listening from the doorway. "I moved most of my stuff to the attic bedroom last week. Mom said I needed to clear out for Great-Grandma's physical therapy equipment." I shot him a grateful look. "That's very thoughtful, Aiden." He shrugged. the universal teenage gesture of deflecting praise. "It's still got my bed and everything. It's on this floor, down the hall from the bathroom." As I helped Mom to her feet, supporting her as she adjusted her grip on the walker, Sarah appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her expression tightly controlled. "We need to discuss living arrangements," she announced. "This situation, clearly, isn't working." Mom straightened as much as her recovering body would allow, summoning dignity despite her exhaustion. "You're right, Sarah. It isn't working. But not for the reasons you think." I watched my mother navigate carefully toward Aiden's offered room, her walker making soft thumps against the hardwood floors that she had personally refinished decades ago. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, not just physically, but emotionally. A journey through a home that no longer acknowledged her presence or her history. The depth of her isolation in this house full of family struck me with painful clarity. How had we allowed this to happen? How had I failed to protect her from this gradual erasure, this subtle but relentless displacement from the center of her own life? That night, as I drove home to update Thomas on the situation, I felt a resolve hardening within me. This wasn't just about a house or legal ownership. It was about justice, respect, and the obligation we have to protect those who protected us. Tomorrow, I decided I would bring the trust documents. It was time for the truth to come out. I slept poorly that night, my mind cycling through the confrontation at Mom's house and the despair in her voice as she surveyed her transformed home. By morning, I had made my decision. After a brief conversation with Thomas, who fully supported my plan, I called Eleanor Griggs to ensure I understood exactly how to proceed. "The trust document is clear," Eleanor confirmed. "Your mother has an absolute right to determine her living arrangements within that house. No one, not even family members living there with her permission, can make changes that substantially impact her quality of life or ability to navigate her home without her consent. And if they refuse to acknowledge this," Eleanor's voice turned steely, "then we move to legal enforcement. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Family conflicts over property rarely benefit anyone when they reach the courts." Armed with the trust documents and Mom's letter, I arrived at the Victorian by mid-morning. The house was quieter than usual, Aiden and Emma at school, Richard presumably at work. I found Sarah in the kitchen, aggressively wiping down already spotless countertops. "We need to talk," I said, setting my bag on the kitchen island. "About Mom's living situation." Sarah's expression immediately hardened. "If you've come to lecture me, save it. We've been more than accommodating to Grandma for years. The one time we ask her to adapt to our needs, she throws a tantrum and you take her side." "This isn't about sides, Sarah. It's about legal reality and basic respect." Her eyebrows rose at the word legal, wariness replacing defensiveness. "What are you talking about?" "Where's Mom?" I asked, not wanting to begin this conversation without her present. "In Aiden's room. She refused breakfast, said she wasn't hungry." Sarah's tone suggested this was further evidence of Mom being difficult, rather than a natural response to yesterday's confrontation. I found Mom sitting by the window in Aiden's hastily cleared room, gazing out at what remained of her garden. She looked small in the oversized gaming chair that served as the room's only seating option besides the bed. Her walker stood nearby, a medical intrusion in a space decorated with sports posters and video game memorabilia. "Good morning," I said, softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, a wan smile briefly lifting her expression. "Margaret, I didn't expect you so early. I've brought something important we need to discuss. Can you join Sarah and me in the kitchen?" She nodded, leveraging herself carefully out of the chair and onto her walker. The short journey to the kitchen was slow, each step measured and deliberate. Sarah watched our approach with barely concealed impatience, arms crossed defensively across her chest. "Before we start," I said once Mom was settled at the kitchen table, "I want to be clear that what I'm about to share comes from a place of love, for all of us." This family means everything to me, and I want us to find a way forward that respects everyone's needs and rights. Sarah's posture remained rigid, but she nodded slightly. I removed the trust document from my bag, placing it on the table between us. Mom, would you like to explain this, or should I? Mom studied the familiar paperwork, something shifting in her expression, a rekindling of determination in eyes that had seemed defeated just yesterday. I think perhaps you should, Margaret. My voice doesn't seem to carry much weight in this house anymore. I turned to Sarah, choosing my words carefully. 8 years ago, Mom met with her attorney, Eleanor Griggs, to establish a specialized property trust for this house. She was thinking ahead, wanting to protect both the property and her right to live in it as she aged. Sarah's expression remained guarded. What kind of trust? It's called a life estate trust, I explained. It means that while Mom remains alive, she has an absolute legal right to reside in this house in the manner of her choosing. No one can alter her living arrangements without her consent or remove her from the property against her will. Sarah's face flushed. Are you saying we don't own this house? After everything we've invested in it? You've been living here at Mom's invitation, I clarified. The legal ownership remains with the trust, with Mom as the beneficiary during her lifetime. But we've been paying the property taxes, the maintenance, the renovations. Sarah's voice rose with each point. And you've been living here rent-free for 5 years, I countered. In a neighborhood where similar houses rent for thousands monthly. The financial balance is hardly in your disfavor. Mom spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. I've never asked for payment, Sarah. I opened my home to your family when you needed help. Not as a business arrangement, but because that's what family does. I've accommodated countless changes to my home and routines to make room for your family's needs. I've watched my furniture disappear, my garden shrink, my belongings packed away, all without complaint. She gestured to the trust document. This isn't about money or ownership in the conventional sense. It's about ensuring that in my final years, I wouldn't be treated as an inconvenience in the home I've spent my life creating, that I would maintain the dignity of making my own choices about my living environment. Sarah stared at the document, the legal reality slowly sinking in. Her next words emerged barely above a whisper. So we have no right to be here at all? You could evict us any time? That's not what this is about, Mom said gently. I have no desire to disrupt your family's life. All I want is for my own needs and preferences to be given consideration. To have my bedroom remain where it's always been. To be consulted before my belongings are removed or replaced. To be treated not as a guest or a burden, but as the person whose lifetime of work made this home possible in the first place. Something in Sarah's expression shifted. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. What exactly does this mean for us? For our plans? I slid the document toward her. It means several things. First, Mom has the legal right to maintain her bedroom on the ground floor, as her medical team has recommended. Second, any significant changes to the house that affect her living space need her approval. And third, the house cannot be sold during her lifetime without her consent. But Richard's office will need to be relocated, I finished firmly. Perhaps to the upstairs room you've just renovated. The design choices you've made would actually be more appropriate for a home office than for an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery. Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight visibly draining from her. I need to discuss this with Richard. Of course, I agreed. But Mom's bedroom needs to be restored today. She needs a proper recovery space that doesn't require navigating stairs against medical advice. Mom reached across the table, covering Sarah's hand with her own weathered one. I'm not trying to assert control for control's sake, Sarah. I just want to live with dignity in the home I've loved for 60 years. Surely we can find an arrangement that respects both your family's needs and mine? The genuine question in Mom's voice The openness to compromise, even after all that had happened, seemed to finally breach Sarah's defensiveness. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at her grandmother's hand covering her own. "I never meant—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "We never intended to make you feel unwelcome." "I know," Mom said softly. "But intentions and impact don't always align." As I watched this exchange, I felt a cautious hope beginning to emerge. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once damaged, requires time and consistent effort to rebuild. But this moment of genuine connection, of Mom's needs being acknowledged, rather than dismissed, represented a crucial first step. The trust document had provided more than legal protection. It had created space for an honest conversation about respect, consideration, and the true meaning of family obligation. It had given Mom's voice the weight it should have carried all along. The next several days brought a flurry of activity in the Victorian. Richard, upon being shown the trust documents, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and pragmatism. Though clearly displeased by the legal reality of their living situation, he recognized the futility of fighting it. "So we need to relocate my office upstairs," he said after a tense family meeting. "Fine. The lighting is actually better up there anyway." His attempt to save face was transparent, but I chose not to push. What mattered was the outcome. Mom's bedroom would be restored, and her authority in her own home would be acknowledged, however reluctantly. The process of restoring Mom's ground floor bedroom revealed just how thoroughly she had been erased from the space. Almost none of her furniture remained in the house. Her bed had been donated to a local shelter. Her dresser and nightstands had been sold online. Her reading chair, a beloved piece she'd rescued from a thrift store and reupholstered, herself in the 1970s, had been given away to Richard's coworker. "We'll need to replace everything," I told Sarah after inventorying what was missing. "Mom needs proper bedroom furniture that suits her needs and preferences." Sarah nodded, a new awareness tempering her responses. "I have the contact information for the shelter where we donated her bed. Maybe they still have it?" They didn't, as it turned out. But the acknowledgement that we needed to replace what had been removed, rather than simply imposing new solutions, represented progress. Mom approached the situation with characteristic practicality. "I don't need everything to be exactly the same," she assured me when I expressed frustration about her missing possessions. "A bed, a dresser, a comfortable chair. That's all I really need." But I had seen the momentary flashes of grief cross her face when she discovered particular items missing. The handmade quilt from her mother, the bedside lamp Tom had given her on their first anniversary, the small watercolors painted by her sister that had hung on her bedroom walls for decades. "We're going to make this right," I promised her. "Not just the furniture, but everything." While Richard and Sarah's children helped move his office equipment upstairs, I drove Mom to Eleanor's office to review the full terms of the trust. It was time for her to reclaim not just her bedroom, but her understanding of her legal standing in her own home. "The terms are quite straightforward," Eleanor explained, speaking directly to Mom rather than through me. "You have what's called a life estate, which means you have the absolute right to use and enjoy the property for the remainder of your life. After your passing, the property transfers according to the terms you've specified in the trust." Mom nodded, absorbing this information. "And my right to determine what happens in the home while I'm living there?" "Completely protected," Eleanor confirmed. "While you've generously allowed your granddaughter's family to reside there with you, they do so at your invitation. They cannot make significant changes to your living environment without your consent, nor can they attempt to remove you from the property." "And if they tried?" Mom asked, her voice steady. "Then, as trustee, Margaret would have legal authority to enforce the terms of the trust on your behalf, including potentially removing them from the property if necessary." Mom was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "I don't want it to come to that. They're still my family, regardless of how things have developed." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. The trust isn't meant as a weapon, but as protection, ensuring you maintain agency in your own home for the remainder of your life. As we left Eleanor's office, Mom seemed thoughtful, processing everything she'd learned. In the car, she finally spoke. "I should have told you about the trust years ago, Margaret. I didn't want you to think I was being secretive or manipulative." "You were being prudent," I assured her, "and in retrospect, extremely wise." She smiled slightly. Eleanor insisted, actually. She's seen too many elderly clients lose control of their homes and lives because they didn't have proper legal protections in place. I never really thought I'd need to invoke the trust's provisions with my own family, but... She trailed off, the reality of recent events hanging between us. "But family dynamics can change in ways we don't anticipate," I finished for her. Back at the Victorian, we found significant progress had been made. Richard's office equipment had been relocated upstairs, and the ground floor room had been cleared, awaiting Mom's new furniture. But the most surprising change was in Aidan, who approached us as soon as we arrived. "Great-Grandma, I found some of your things in the basement," he said, clearly proud of himself. The boxes were labeled Helen's, personal items. "I didn't open them, but I thought you might want them back now that you're getting your room again." Mom's face lit up. "Aidan, that's wonderful. Would you help me look through them?" Together, they spent the afternoon unpacking dusty boxes that contained segments of Mom's life. Photo albums, books, the hand-painted teacups she'd collected, small mementos that held significance only to her. Each item emerged like a small resurrection, pieces of her identity returning from exile. Sarah observed this process from the doorway, her expression complicated. "I didn't realize we'd packed away so much," she said finally. "It seemed like decluttering at the time, but seeing it all come back now, it probably did seem that way," I acknowledged, trying to keep accusation from my tone. "But these aren't just items, Sarah. They're pieces of your grandmother's life, tangible connections to her memories and experiences." That evening, we gathered in the living room, still modern and sleek, but now with Mom's teacup collection returned to its cabinet and several of her cherished photographs back on the mantel. The atmosphere remained somewhat tense, but beneath the discomfort lay something new, a renegotiation of boundaries and expectations, a recalibration of respect. "I've been thinking," Richard began, addressing Mom directly. "The garden space we converted for the children's play area. We could restore part of it for your roses. The kids hardly use the swing set anymore, and there's plenty of room for both." The olive branch, however small, was significant coming from him. Mom nodded, accepting the gesture. "I'd like that. Perhaps Aidan and Emma might want to help with the planting. I could teach them about propagating roses from cuttings." "I'll help too," Sarah offered quietly. "I remember you teaching me when I was their age. The miniature roses by the back gate were always my favorites. The conversation wasn't forced or artificially cheerful. There were still uncomfortable silences and moments of awkwardness. The damage done over years wouldn't be repaired in a single evening. But something fundamental had shifted. Mom was no longer a guest or an inconvenience in her own home. She was its owner, its heart, the keeper of its history. And most importantly, she knew it. Later, as I prepared to leave, Mom walked me to the door, her walker forgotten as she held my arm for support instead. "Thank you," she said simply. Not just for the legal help, but for seeing what was happening when I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge it. I hugged her gently, mindful of her healing hip. "You've spent your life taking care of everyone else, Mom. It's about time someone advocated for you." As I drove home, I reflected on the power of clear boundaries, of legal protections, and of the courage it takes to insist on respect. Mom had reclaimed more than her bedroom today. She had reclaimed her place at the center of her own life, not as an accommodation or an afterthought, but as her fundamental right. The weeks that followed brought gradual but meaningful changes. to the Victorian on Maple Avenue. Mom's bedroom was restored, not exactly as it had been before, but thoughtfully arranged to accommodate both her preferences and her recovery needs. The new bed was similar to her original one, but with adjustable features that made getting in and out easier. Her reading chair, though unable to be recovered, was replaced with one of comparable comfort that she selected herself. More significant than the physical changes, however, was the shift in household dynamics. Family meetings became a regular occurrence, with everyone, including Mom, having equal voice in decisions that affected shared spaces. The previously unilateral process of home renovation slowed considerably, with changes now discussed collectively rather than simply imposed. Richard, though initially the most resistant to this new democratic approach, gradually adjusted his expectations. "I've been thinking about relocating my home office to the converted garage," he mentioned during one family dinner. "It would give me more separation between work and home life, and free up the upstairs room for a proper guest space." The suggestion, offered without pressure or expectation, demonstrated a growing understanding that the house needed to work for everyone, not just his professional aspirations. Sarah's transformation was more complicated and nuanced. Years of viewing her grandmother primarily as an elderly dependent requiring accommodation rather than the home's rightful owner couldn't be undone overnight. There were still moments of tension, small skirmishes over kitchen organization or television volume, fleeting expressions of impatience when Mom moved slowly or needed assistance. But there were also moments of reconnection. I arrived one afternoon to find Sarah and Mom sitting at the kitchen table, heads bent together over a photo album I hadn't seen in years. "I'd forgotten Dad took these when we visited the Grand Canyon," Sarah was saying, pointing to a faded photograph of herself at 12, gangly and sunburned, standing proudly at the canyon's edge. "You were so scared I'd fall in. You kept getting closer to the edge every time I turned my back," Mom recalled, smiling at the memory. "Your father thought it was hilarious. I threatened to make him sleep in the car if he didn't help keep you corralled." These small moments of shared history and genuine connection began to rebuild what had been damaged. The process wasn't always smooth. Old habits of dismissing Mom's preferences or making decisions without consulting her occasionally resurfaced. But now there was a framework for addressing these lapses, a shared understanding that respect wasn't optional but essential. The garden became a particular focal point for healing. As spring advanced, Mom supervised the restoration of her rose beds, directing operations from a comfortable chair while Aiden and occasionally Richard did the heavy digging. Emma, discovering an unexpected interest in horticulture, became Mom's primary assistant, carefully recording the names and care requirements of each plant in a dedicated notebook. "Great-grandma says these roses have been propagated from the same plants for almost 100 years, she informed me proudly during one of my visits. "We're going to take cuttings next fall so I can learn how to start new ones." The Victorian was gradually becoming what it should have been all along, a true multi-generational home where each person's needs and contributions were valued, where history and modernity coexisted rather than competed, where the wisdom of age was respected alongside the energy of youth. By midsummer, 6 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, the Victorian on Maple Avenue had transformed once again, not back to what it had been before Sarah's family moved in, but into something new and potentially stronger. Like a bone that heals after breaking, the family structure had reformed around a more honest acknowledgement of needs, boundaries, and mutual respect. Mom's recovery progressed steadily, her determination in physical therapy paying dividends as she gradually regained mobility. The walker gave way to a cane, which she used less frequently as her strength returned. By July, she was spending hours in her restored garden, seated on a specially designed gardening stool that Richard had researched and ordered without prompting. "It's ergonomic," he explained when it arrived, demonstrating the adjustable height and padded seat. "And the side pouches can hold your tools so you don't have to keep bending to reach them." The thoughtful gift represented more than just practical assistance. It was an acknowledgement of Mom's passions and priorities, a tangible recognition that her gardening wasn't merely a hobby to be tolerated, but an essential part of her identity, worth supporting. The home's interior reflected similar thoughtful integration. Mom's antiques now coexisted with Sarah and Richard's more contemporary pieces, creating an eclectic blend that somehow worked better than either style in isolation. The formal dining room, once a battleground over Mom's bridge club, now hosted both her card games and Emma's art projects, the large table accommodating multiple generations and activities. I noticed the change most clearly in how decisions were communicated. Rather than pronouncements about what needed to happen, conversations began with questions. How would you feel about? Or, what do you think of the idea of? Simple shifts in language that reflected more fundamental shifts in perspective. Not every issue was resolved perfectly. Sarah still occasionally slipped into managing Mom rather than consulting her. Richard's work priorities sometimes took precedence over family needs. The teenagers had their moments of typical adolescent self-absorption, but the baseline expectation had fundamentally changed. Mom's voice mattered. Her preferences carried weight. Her history in the home was valued rather than erased. One warm evening in August, I arrived for dinner to find the entire family on the front porch. Mom in her favorite wicker chair, Sarah arranging a tray of lemonade, Richard and Aiden engaged in a chess match while Emma sketched something in her notebook. The scene was so natural, so comfortably intergenerational, that it took my breath away. "Margaret!" Mom called, waving me up the steps. "Come see what Emma's designed." Emma shyly turned her sketchbook toward me, revealing detailed drawings of what appeared to be garden plans. "It's a memorial garden for Great-Grandpa," she explained. "Great-Grandma's been telling me stories about him, and I thought we could dedicate the west corner to plants that were special to him." Sarah added, "We thought it could be a family project this fall. Mom has all these wonderful stories about Dad that the kids have never heard." As I settled into a chair, accepting the glass of lemonade Sarah offered, I marveled at the journey we'd all taken. 6 months ago, this family had been fracturing along fault lines of entitlement and resentment. Mom had been physically and emotionally marginalized in her own home, her presence tolerated rather than treasured. The legal trust had provided the necessary leverage to correct the power imbalance, but the real healing had come through countless small moments of reconnection, through the willingness of everyone, particularly Sarah and Richard, to recognize and correct harmful patterns. The Victorian had become what Mom had always intended it to be, a true family home where multiple generations could thrive together, each contributing their unique strengths while respecting the other's needs. The house remained physically the same, still the gracious old structure Mom had lovingly restored over decades, but the atmosphere within its walls had transformed completely. As the evening progressed, I watched Mom engage fully with her family, teaching Emma about plant combinations, commenting on Aiden's chess strategy, discussing an upcoming community event with Sarah. Her eyes were bright, her posture confident, her voice clear and respected. She was, once again, the heart of her home rather than its forgotten footnote. The transformation wasn't just in how others treated her, but in how she carried herself, with the quiet dignity of someone who knows her worth and expects it to be recognized. The defeated woman who had whispered, "I don't recognize my own home anymore," had been replaced by someone who once again belonged exactly where she was. As autumn painted the Victorian's garden in amber and crimson, I found myself reflecting on the journey our family had taken. 1 year had passed since Mom's hip replacement, the catalyst that had brought simmering tensions to a boiling point and ultimately forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, respect, and the meaning of home. Sarah invited me for coffee one crisp October morning, just the two of us sitting on the back porch that overlooked Mom's revitalized garden. Emma's memorial section for her great-grandfather was taking shape in the western corner, carefully labeled plantings marking each of his favorites, I've been thinking a lot about last year, Sarah said, cradling her mug between her hands. About how differently I saw everything then. I waited, giving her space to continue. I really believed we were doing what was best for Grandma, she admitted. I convinced myself that her resistance was just stubbornness, that she couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else. She paused, gazing out at the garden where Mom and Aiden were working together, gathering the last of the season's herbs. I never stopped to consider that maybe I was the one who couldn't see clearly. Perspective is a powerful filter, I offered. We all interpret situations through our own needs and beliefs. Sarah nodded. The thing is, Mom, I think I was afraid. Afraid of Grandma getting older. Afraid of becoming responsible for her care. Afraid of what that might mean for our family's future. It was easier to start seeing her as a problem to solve rather than a person to cherish. Her honesty touched me deeply. Fear makes us do things we later regret. When you showed me that deed, I was angry at first. Felt like I'd been tricked. Somehow. A rueful smile crossed her face. It took me weeks to realize what should have been obvious from the beginning. This was never about legal ownership. It was about respect and gratitude. About remembering whose life's work made this home possible in the first place. Below us in the garden, Mom was showing Aiden how to properly divide perennials for replanting. Her movements were sure and practiced, her knowledge flowing from decades of working this same soil. At 84, she remained the authority on what would thrive in each microclimate of the yard she had cultivated for 60 years. The deed didn't change anything that shouldn't have already been true, Sarah said softly, following my gaze. It just reminded us of what we should have never forgotten. That was it, exactly. The trust document hadn't created Mom's right to dignity and respect in her own home. It had merely formalized what should have been freely given out of love and gratitude. The legal protection had been necessary only because the emotional protection had failed. As I watched Mom teaching her great-grandson the patience of gardening, the understanding that roots grow strongest when given proper space and care, I thought about what we'd all learned through this painful, necessary recalibration. That genuine family strength comes not from control but from mutual respect. That aging doesn't diminish one's right to self-determination. That a house becomes a true home only when everyone within its walls is seen, heard, and valued. And most importantly, that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for those we love is simply to ensure their story isn't erased. That the deed to their life's work remains firmly in their hands until they themselves choose to let it go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.